People in France were quite angered by the attack. We see a lot of people who used to be moderates or used to be, I say, lenient toward Islamist rhetoric, who said, okay, that was enough. You also have to consider the left-wing extremism. We had a number of sabotage of a different, either like government building or 5G antennas, or places that be considered a legitimate target for left-wing extremism.
We hear an awful lot about terrorism in France. What is the reality on the ground? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada, and you're listening to Canadian Intelligence, eh? When it comes to acts of violent extremism, i.e., terrorism, in the past couple years, the ones that have really gotten our attention are the large scale ones, or the ones that really kind of hit us emotionally. And unfortunately, in this regard, France is a nation that has suffered some absolutely catastrophic acts. Think of the attacks in 2015 at the Bataclan Theatre in the Stade de France, in which over 100 were killed. Think of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which was an attack on press freedom. Think of the beheading of Samuel Paty, a teacher, a couple of months ago. And it seems that France has a disproportionate number of attacks carried out by Islamist extremists in the Western world. There have also been some allegations, though, that perhaps the far right is something which we need to worry about in France. I'm not an expert on what's happening in France, but I certainly have brought in somebody who very much is a person who knows an awful lot about the situation in France. So I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today, joining me from Paris in France by Alexandre Rodde, who is a researcher in France looking at the problems of terrorism. He's also a lieutenant in the French Reserves, where he engages in training on terrorism for law enforcement and security officials. So, Alexandre, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here and to be able to talk about terrorism in an intelligent way.
The first question is perhaps one that really interests me, and a lot of people have accused me of dismissing the threat from the far right, which is inaccurate. But let's go with that. I was listening to a podcast, a webinar rather, yesterday on the situation in Western Europe when it came to the far right, especially in Germany and parts of the Balkans, Poland, for example, as well in Eastern Europe. And the people on the webinar seem to suggest that France has a bigger problem than it likes to admit or than people realize. So in this atmosphere, Alexandre, in which everybody's talking about nothing but the far right these days, which I think is highly problematic, how would you describe and delineate the threat from right-wing extremism in your country today?
That's an interesting question. That's something I've heard a lot too. I've read a lot about the terrorism in France and the far right being a major threat. I think, unfortunately, it's a false equivalence. If you start looking at the numbers, we have suffered 46 attacks from the jihadi extremism in France, killing 269 people and injuring more than 1,000. If you look at the far right, we have approximately 30 to 35 cases. If you look at vandalism or anything like extremist assault, for a total of, I think, 11 injured. So we had a number of far right attacks in France. We had mosques being attacked, mosques being shot at, mosques being burned, but mostly like at night when nobody was there. We had a bunch of assault in Dijon and Chalon-sur-Saône in 2017, and two in 2019 in Brest and by the Bayern Mosque. But none of them compare to the degree of sophistication or lethality that we have faced regarding jihadi extremism.
So those are the facts, Alexandre. Why is it, do you think, that a lot of people are saying, well, the far right is what you should be worried about? I mean, the statistics you gave me are quite stark. I mean, over 200 killed by Islamist extremists, over 100 in the Bataclan and Stade de France attacks alone, over 1,000 injured. Why is this conversation turning in this direction as far as some people are concerned? Do you have any insight into that?
My guess would be when you look at extremism, I think Western Europe and the Western world in general have a pretty keen eye about right-wing extremism because of our history, because of what happened during World War II. We know exactly when what is free speech and what is extremism. When you look at jihadi rhetoric or even the far left, it's harder for us Western Europeans to point out what is free speech and what is violent speech or hate speech or anything would lead to violence. So I think it's part of it. We are better equipped to detect extremism when it's on the right. I also saw that there is effort from extremist group to try to legitimize some of the claims of extremist jihadis and Islamists and try to paint them as victim of a system that is oppressing them, which is obviously not the case.
I'm glad you raised that last point, Alexandre, because this is what I want to pick up on next. I certainly have seen a lot of analysis and writing about what's happening in France, and there are certainly a lot of people who are saying that, oh, you can't talk about Islamist extremism because it's perceived as racism, it's perceived as discrimination, and yet, as you say, there have been hundreds killed and over 1,000 wounded by this group. So let's turn to the Charlie Hebdo situation. So in 2015, of course, there was the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and the whole world reacted by saying "Je suis Charlie." Okay, in other words, I support freedom of the press, and I absolutely denunciate this horrendous attack of a terrorist attack on people that were working on a newspaper. That was back in 2015. And yet you look at the recent beheading of Samuel Paty, I believe it was in October of last year, by a Chechen who was angered by the fact that he was discussing Charlie Hebdo and the infamous caricature, the Muhammad cartoons. The reaction was very different in your country and actually in around the world. My prime minister embarrassingly talked about respect rather than denouncing the act of terrorism. Why do you think there's been this shift from a support for freedom of the press, support for freedom of expression, denunciation of terrorism, to a much more muted response with respect to the beheading of Samuel Paty?
I would start to talk about the Je suis Charlie phenomenon. I think it was an interesting and a smart way to promote freedom of speech. Charlie Hebdo is a strong-willed journal. They have opinions that I don't share, especially on law enforcement. But they've been victim of a terrible attack, and at that moment, the important part was supporting them and saying that that wasn't okay. You couldn't attack journalists, you couldn't attack satirists because of a cartoon. Uh, in regard to what happened to Samuel Paty, so I'm quite familiar with the case. I had the opportunity to train the law enforcement response that arrived on scene just a couple of weeks before the attack took place. Um, I think the attack was poorly perceived, and I think our friend Liam Duffy could mention that in his recent articles about the Anglo-Saxon press and trying to describe it as a case of law enforcement violence on a minority, and France being on the verge of turning to the far right. It's not the case. I think people in France were quite angered by the attack. We see a lot of people who used to be moderates or used to be, I say, lenient toward uh, Islamist rhetoric, who said, okay, that was enough. We had a teacher being beheaded in the street for a class he gave about free speech and freedom of having different ideas. So I think a lot of French concept and a lot of the French context too was poorly understood by the Anglo-Saxon press and was used in a North American context as something as an equivalence, which it wasn't. I say that in France, so Samuel Paty received national homage from the president in the University of the Sorbonne. Is seen as a hero by a lot of French people, and I think a lot of them realize the danger of Islamist rhetoric and jihadist violence.
It's interesting you point out that there was a very almost like black and white treatment of the case in the Anglo press. It didn't receive nearly as much condemnation as it did in the press in France. And I have noticed that there was a move within sort of the French, I don't know, elite classes to sort of move away from criticizing Islamist extremism. So, if I understand you correct, Alexandre, do you see in the wake of the Samuel Paty attack, there's almost a move back to being very critical of Islamist violent rhetoric in your country? In other words, is this movement to sort of say, "Hey, let's leave this alone"? You know, it's verging into racism, it's verging into Islamophobia. Is that movement been checked because of the horrible slaying of Samuel Paty?
I think, yeah, kind of. I think what happened is, if you look at the attacks in the last few years, in 2018, we had three jihadist attacks on French soil. In 2019, the same numbers. Some of them were horrific. We had more than 4 people killed in the police headquarters in Paris. But there were less attacks than the years before. This year, we are facing 7 attacks, 8 if you include the Boulogne case in December. So I think the resurgence of jihadi attacks kind of remind people who are not working on the field, not working on the subject, that the threat is real, the threat is growing. And it also happened just after the President Macron speech on separatism
Hmm.
and about the danger of rhetoric used by Islamist extremists about building their own enclave in France and trying to separate for the rest of the population. So I think that the speech of the president 2 weeks before the attack and the multiplication of the attacks over the last few months kind of reminded the French people of the danger and the threat that was arising in France.
That's an excellent segue, Alexandre, because I was going to ask you about Macron's speech in which he talked about like Islamist separatism in France, almost the creation of a separate society. And you know better than I do that there certainly are socioeconomic challenges when it comes to the Muslim population of France over the years, ex-colonials coming, et cetera, the whole migration problem. Macron's speech was initially well regarded, I think, especially in the Western world, but he got an awful lot of backlash from the Muslim world. Talks about embargoes on French products. I believe French flags were burned, photos of Macron were burned, and he kind of backtracked a little bit in the wake of this reaction. Where does this debate stand now? So it's a few months after the speech, as you noted. Where's the sentiment right now in France? Was Macron simply stating an obvious fact? Um, is there still a perception that he was on the right track? That although maybe it was worded a little in a little clumsy fashion, what is the general feeling right now in France when it comes to that? What Macron calls this Islamic or Muslim separatism in your country?
I think it was well received at first. We had both people on the right and the left who agreed with the statement, who agreed with the summary of the situation he was making at the time. I think some of his words were either poorly translated or maliciously poorly translated in part of the Muslim world. So we had a bunch of boycott of French product. We had French flag being burned, which I mean, like, is freedom of speech. Is an okay response to such claims. But there was also an attack in our consulate in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. One of the security contractor got
Yes.
injured.
Mhm.
So it was a serious situation. I'd say that for most of the French people agree with the statement he made and support the laws that are being implemented right now. So we're creating a law against separatism. We can go to jail for trying to basically to relocate from the French society, or also also including a law about trying to interfere with freedom of speech in class and trying to refrain teachers from teaching some subjects that we have seen in the past and was so prevalent in the Samuel Paty attack.
So, in other words, these plans by the French government to crack down on a situation that, frankly, has been developing for decades in your country is seeing some support. I'm going to ask you a very unfair question, Alexandre, and I appreciate you may not be able to give me a very robust response, but a lot of us here in the West, so in Canada, in North America, other parts of Western Europe, for example, see the situation in France as a particularly dire, a particularly bad one in terms of the potential for Islamist terrorism, Islamist extremism. Can you summarize for my listeners who don't know perhaps as much about France, what are some of the causes, the drivers, the reasons why France has a disproportionate number of Islamist extremist attacks in the Western world?
I think there are a number of reasons. So we suffered 46 attacks since 2015, starting with the Charlie Hebdo attacks and finishing with the attack in the Nice church last October. A number of reasons that explain that. First one, we have an important Muslim population, which is have been preyed on by Islamists who are trying to radicalize part of the young people, which is true. Um, Second, socioeconomic problems always play a role, if it's not a more prevalent role than usually said, but it counts. And I would say that because of the special relationship between church and state in France and the importance of laicite or secularism, even if it's poorly translated. And we have been a prevalent victim of terrorism. There is two laws in the early 2000s that two elements in the early 2000s that kind of allowed terrorists to describe us as a primary target. The first one is the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, who have been republished in the Muslim world and used as an excuse to attack us. And the second one is the anti-veil law, which is not a
Mhm.
law. It was described as that by Muslim extremists. But it's mostly a law that forbids children to wear prominent religious sign in schools. The idea behind that, and the idea behind the secular principle, that schools should be a place where you have no expression of religion, and you are able to learn and grow in a neutral environment. So therefore, he was forbidding Muslim girls to wear veil in schools until the age of 18, and it's a law that in universities. And it was used as once again an excuse and a reason to target us, especially.
And there's no question that foreign states have taken advantage of these of this legislation, for example, as well as the Charlie Hebdo, satire. And I agree with you. I don't particularly like Charlie Hebdo either, but I mean, you do have freedom of speech laws, and it's never helpful when foreign states misinterpret or use these particular things for their own advantage to foment violence. Another aspect, Alexandre, that I want to explore with you today is France's military missions abroad. Now, of course, we all know that France had significant colonial responsibility in parts of Western Africa, parts of the Sahel, and that the Sahel is a very dangerous part of the world right now. The rise of Islamist extremism in the Sahel is extremely it's high. It's very worrisome. We have groups aligned with Al Qaeda, such as Al Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. We have groups aligned with Islamic State in the area. Of course, we have Boko Haram in Nigeria, not a former French colony, but we're seeing incursions into various countries in which France was a colonial power. For example, in Mali, I was in Mali a couple of years ago doing some training on radicalization. The situation is extremely touchy. There have been attacks weekly in that part of the world. In response to this, the French military has been involved in a number of operations, Operation Serval and Operation Barkhane. For my listeners' interest, Canada was also part of the mission in the Sahel, providing some logistics support. I've always argued that military missions, when it comes to counterterrorism, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. They do some good, but they also incur some backlash, some reaction. So the first question, Alexandre, is in your opinion, how effective and how necessary is the French military mission in parts of the Sahel in Africa?
So I'm no military expert. Operation Barkhane, which is ongoing right now in 5 Sahelian countries, gather 5,000 troops there. Um, it started with Operation Serval, whose goal was to stop a jihadist advance on the capital of Mali, and then evolved to security missions all over the 5 countries in the Sahelian region to try to defend the regime over there from jihadist attacks. Um, it's been mostly effective. We've been able to prevent and to kill a number of high importance targets, and it's been ongoing now since 2013. It has been used as an argument by jihadist propagandists, mostly from the Sahelian groups, to call it either neo-colonial or a reason to attack France. And I think it's a dangerous argument that we have often heard of. If you are involved abroad in Muslim country, you're kind of looking for a security backlash at home, and yeah, so I think it's a dangerous way to approach it. I mean, like the situation was dire, we are called by an ally to defend it, and therefore the ongoing mission was just to be able to conserve the security gains that have been made in the region.
I know that when it comes to foreign military missions, it's you have to be careful because if too many soldiers come back dead, it can affect public opinion. Here in Canada, of course, we were in Afghanistan for over a decade. Over 160 Canadian soldiers were killed as part of the ISAF and NATO mission to Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. What has been the reaction in France? Because there have been French soldiers who've been killed either in military accidents in the Sahel or have died by IEDs, improvised explosive devices. What has been the reaction, generally speaking, in the French public, the French media, when reports about French soldiers dying in a war, thousands of kilometers away? Do people see this as unnecessary? Is there some kind of demand that the military mission end, or is it a sort of a rallying cry for patriotism and patriotic support for the French military in France?
Uh, so, so we've lost around 50 soldiers over the last uh, 7 years in Mali and the neighboring region. Public opinion about it is mostly supportive of it. The mission started to defend a population against jihadist attack, so that main purpose is appreciated by the French people and mostly agreed with. Because of the recent losses, we had discussion about reducing the number of troops over there, reducing the scope of the mission. But it's the public pressure is not really on the subject, and it's not too big of a subject in the public opinion of France, and we don't have a strong public will to try to remove French troops from abroad.
So, in other words, it looks like the military efforts, even if they're scaled back, will continue for some time in the Sahel.
That would be my guess.
Okay. Alexander, last question for you. I want to ask you to sort of speculate on what's going to happen next in France. As you said, there has been a spike in Islamist extremist attacks in 2020. I don't think there's been any so far in 2021. If you could sort of share with my listeners some idea as to where do you see the threat going? So is it a matter of an increased sort of threat from Islamist extremism? Do you think the far right is going to get their act in gear and become more organized, perhaps with help from the far right in other Western European countries? There's a lot of talk these days about sort of the internationalization of the far right. Not really sure what that means, but and I'm not sure if it's accurate. But you know, from the security perspective, I assume your country has a threat level. You rank the general threat from terrorism in Canada. It's at level 3. Is it been at medium for the past decade, as far as I can tell. Where do you see violent extremism going in your country, Alexandre?
So I think you have to start by talking about the jihadi situation. We had a growing number of attacks last year. I think it's going to start. It's going to start again this year. We have a few elements who are proving to be increasing the threat. The coronavirus is being one of them. The jihadists know that the security system is under stress, so it's easier to attack now. Because of the lockdown and the curfews, it's harder to find a target. So it slowed down a bunch of efforts from jihadists to strike. But they stay the first threat in France by sheer numbers, because of their organization and the lethality they can bring to an attack. When the situation is going to end, we're probably going to have to face a number of attacks. Another element was interesting on the subject is that we are going to be uh, organizing the trial for the Bataclan attacks, the subsequent attack of
Yes.
November the 13th. Um, that kind of event usually brings up the threat level of the Vigipirate plan, which is the monitor of the threat in France. So that's going to be a big question. Um, we're also afraid of some what we call the reciprocal radicalisation, and because of the number of jihadist attacks from the far right, who decide to strike back. There is a growing number of people interested in far right extremism. There is a number of signs, mostly in neighboring countries, especially Germany, then the far right could be organizing, could be strategizing about striking in Western Europe. So it is obviously a concern. You also have to consider the left-wing extremism. We had a number of sabotage of a different, either like government building or 5G
Mhm.
antennas, or places that be considered a legitimate target for left-wing extremism, car dealership,
Mhm.
for example. So it's also a concern. Usually, they have less of a violent intent, and they don't want to kill anyone. But the sabotage has been growing, and the violence and the at least the will to strike law enforcement personnel is a concern for us.
I'm not going to put you down to a prediction, Alexandre, because I don't like predicting, but it seems from what you've told me in this podcast that at least it is most likely that in 2021, at least for the immediate future, the most lethal brand of terrorism, it will be the Islamist variety. So yes, the far right is there, and you mentioned the far left about attacking 5G towers, attacking car dealerships. But when it comes to the actual targeting of French citizens for killing and or seriously wounding, it is your assessment that the number one threat, at least for the foreseeable future, will continue to be that comes from the Islamist extremist milieu.
Most definitely, I think the jihadists are the main threat in France, and they have so that's what keeps us concerned and ready.
So I'm assuming that when it comes to the DST and the various police forces in your country, that would be their operational priority until such time as any intelligence or information comes in to change the priority.
Definitely, if you look at the fish S with S cards, where a way
Yes.
to organize and describe people who are considered like dangerous for the state of France, most of them are created and followed are concerns Islamist extremists that could be potential offenders.
One last thing, Alexandre, I'm glad you mentioned the Fiche S. I was, years ago, I was aware of the numbers, and I think there were 18,000 people on this Fiche S. So for my listeners, this is basically people who've been identified as being potential terrorist threats in France. And as you say, the vast majority of the Fiche S are Islamist extremists. Do you have is there a most recently publicly available number on how many people are on
I
that
think
list, Alexandre?
the open source number was from 2018, and it was 29,000, with something like two-thirds being Islamist extremist. Uh,
29,000.
yeah, 29,000.
Wow. As somebody who worked in security intelligence for 30 years, I can tell you following 29,000 people is simply impossible, which means that the French security forces have to prioritize and try to determine who poses the greatest risk versus who is just going to, say stupid things online. In other words, there are people that talk the talk and people that walk the walk. This must be a tremendous challenge for the security services in France.
It is. The open source number are, for 2018, were out of the 29,000, close to 10,000 were followed on a daily basis at least. And the people have,
10,000 follow on a daily basis.
yeah, at least were like the subject of some level of surveillance.
That's an incredible. I can't comprehend a security service that has to worry about. Oh wow, that's Alexandre. You've really opened, I think, my eyes and the eyes of many of my listeners to just how dangerous the situation is in France. And as we all agree, all 10,000 are not going to do something. But even if a small percentage, even if 1% of the 10,000 people plan something serious, that's 100 people that are going to carry out attacks either on the scale of the Stade de France and the Bataclan Theater or on the scale of Samuel Paty. That's a very, very worrisome number of people.
The situation is concerning. It's been for law enforcement for the last 5 years, and we are extremely aware of the level of the threat. A couple of things that are able to protect the French population is the fact that it's really hard to find firearms in France. So we have terrorists who like relied on less sophisticated modus operandi, like knife attacks or car
Right,
attacks, which is
right.
make it harder to me for terrorist attack to be mass scaled. Yet it's concerning, yes.
I mean, obviously, you had the attack in Nice. I think I forget how many deaths were caused by that, but that was a guy in a truck essentially driving down the boulevard in Nice. So that can be, in fact, quite lethal. Alexandre, I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time and joining me from Paris today to talk about the situation in France. It's so nice to hear from somebody who knows in great detail what's happening in your country, the challenges you face, the numbers you've shared with my listeners are very scary numbers indeed. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you for having me. It was really interesting to discuss those issues with someone who knows the subject.
That was my conversation with Alexandre Rodde in Paris, France. And what do you think? Do you know anything about the situation in France? Do you think that he gave us an accurate picture of the threat level? Let me know. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @borealissaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like this content, you can get more of it every day to your inbox. Simply subscribe. Go to Borealis Threat Risk Consulting, hit the subscribe button, provide your email address. You'll get all the material free of charge, as well as material that only subscribers get. I'd love to hear from you what you thought of this podcast and others. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.